Today we're going to do a quick walk around the Belfast City Cemetery and talk to you about a number of graves, but this is only a sample of the wide selection of graves and personalities that are to be found in this cemetery. There are two big pressures that really begin to shape the need for a new burial ground in Belfast in the middle of the 19th century. The first, of course, is the outbreak, a very serious outbreak of cholera in 1832 in Belfast, and then of course the famine in 1847. And with the existing burial grounds in Belfast filling up very quickly, that was Schenkel Road, Clifton Street, Friars Bush, Belfast Corporation started to look for a new burial ground. In 1866 they bought 100 acres of land here off the Sinclair family of Turf Lodge, and then used 45 of those acres for a new burial ground. The cemetery was designed in the shape of a bell, and it opened on the 1st of August 1869, and the very first burial took place on the 4th of August 1869, and from that day to this there are over 250,000 people buried here in the Belfast City Cemetery. And so this short tour is going to look at some of those citizens of Belfast who are laid to rest here in the Belfast City Cemetery. When it was opened in 1869, it was named the Belfast Cemetery, but the cemetery was extended in 1911 with the acquisition of land at Glenalina, and it was then renamed the Belfast City Cemetery. This is the family plot of the Shillingtons of Glenmackin. Now, the Shillingtons were the owners of Broadway Damask, and that was a linen company which occupied the site of what we know today as the entrance to the Royal Victoria Hospital on Broadway. But they have a really strong connection with the Falls Road. They built Broadway Presbyterian Church, which of course we know today as in Culterland. This is the grave of Elisha Scott. He was born on the Donegal Road, and as a youngster he played for Broadway United, and then he went on to play for Liverpool and Ireland. He was a goalkeeper. He still holds a record for the number of matches any one player played for Liverpool. He then came back to Belfast and managed Belfast Celtic, and he was the manager of Belfast Celtic at the height of its winning streak and at the height of its fame. This is the grave of the Reverend Robert Lynn. Reverend Robert Lynn came from Cúlraí, and then he was a minister in Barry Street congregation before moving to May Street congregation, Henry Cook's church. At the Great Unionist Convention of 1892, he spoke to a motion in support of Southern Unionists. So he was Presbyterian minister, but he was a Unionist. But his son, also Robert Lynn, went to Inst, left Inst, was a member of the Dungannon clubs, and ended up in London, where he stayed with his friend Paul Henry. And Paul Henry was of course an artist, and it was Robert Lynn who suggested to Paul Henry that he go and paint in the west of Ireland. But Robert Lynn, the son, was a Republican and a socialist. In London he was in the Gaelic League, was a native Irish speaker, and his daughters were native Irish speakers. He was a friend of James Connolly and wrote the introduction to Connolly's Labour in Irish History. And when Nora Barnacle married James Joyce, they stayed with Robert Lynn in London. So here you have a very good example of someone from that radical tradition of Presbyterianism in our city. This is the Herdman Stone. Herdmans were a very famous mercantile family, Herdmans of Sand Mills. So this stone, the design of this stone is called Egyptian Revivalist. And It's called that because it's designed like the door of an Egyptian temple. You will see a double-headed falcon in a disc. Then you see a column. Over here you'll see the inverted torches. And down here, this is a cosmos flower. But I also think this stone is a stone of a 33rd degree Prince Mason in the ancient and Scottish Rite. The double-headed falcon is the symbol of a Prince Mason. The cross on the dusk is a Templar cross, so Knights Templar. The column is a Corinthian column, the Masonic symbol of beauty. The 5 sets of 4 rings, I think, are a representation of Jacob's ladder. The cosmos flower is the 8-pointed star, the octagram. So there are 2 layers of symbolism here. One, Egyptian revivalist, and the other, Masonic. When this cemetery was being planned, 15 acres were to be given to the Catholics of Belfast and a site for a Catholic mortuary chapel. But in 1869, a dispute arose between the Catholic Bishop Patrick Dorian and the Belfast Corporation. And the dispute was who had the ultimate burial rights for those Catholics to be buried in this cemetery. And what was at dispute was a stillborn child would not be buried in Catholic blessed ground, neither would someone who had committed suicide, or someone who had been excommunicated, or indeed someone who had bought a grave as a Catholic and then became a Protestant. So they couldn't resolve this issue. They went to the highest court in the land till eventually they came up with a compromise. The bishop got £4,000 in compensation, and the corporation was relieved of their responsibility of burying the Catholics of Belfast. The bishop took his £4,000 and promptly bought 15 acres of land across the road, which we know today as Milltown Cemetery. Now, this is the section here that the Catholics were meant to be buried in, but were never buried in. And as you can see, what you think is a path dividing this section from the rest of the burial ground, but in fact this is the line of an underground wall. It runs to the depth of a grave in this section. It is made of the black stone of the perimeter wall, and it runs the whole length of this section. It's probably the most famous feature of this burial ground, its underground wall, and it was to separate out Catholic blessed ground from the rest of the cemetery. This is the grave of Margaret Byers. Margaret was born outside Reilig. When she was 20, she married the Reverend John Byers, a Presbyterian minister, and the young couple then went to Shanghai in China as Presbyterian missionaries. When she was there, Margaret got 2 pieces of news. The first was that she was pregnant, and the second piece of news she got on the day before her baby was born was that her husband was dying. So after the birth of their baby, they then returned back to Ireland. And Margaret stayed in Cookstown for a while, came to Belfast. Margaret Byers was really interested in the education of women, and she opened a school for young ladies in the centre of Belfast. We know that school today as Victoria College. So this is the founder of Victoria College. But look at her headstone and what you will see, the way she is described, the widow of the Reverend John Byers. And I think this is a really classical piece of history. It's a way women wrote out of history. John Byers died about 50 years before Margaret, and yet her life and all her achievements are still put in the context of his life. Here on this headstone you will find an unusual inscription. This is the grave of John Phillips, and John was a Presbyterian missionary in Damascus for 30 years, and you can see in Arabic at the bottom of the stone where it says God is love. here belongs to the English family. We know them as English the bakers. And when I was growing up in 1950s Belfast, they had their factory in Elisha Street in the markets area. Look what it says, in due season ye shall reap if you faint not. And if you notice the corn stalks on the side of the stone. We think these panels are by an artist called Rosamund Prager, who, by the way, also did the panels that were on the doors of the Falls Road Library. This is the grave of Thomas Sinclair. Thomas, his family were very strong Presbyterians. His uncle had founded Sinclair Seamen's Church in Corporation Street, and Thomas was a member of the Dunkern Presbyterian congregation, but he was also in his early days a liberal. But in 1886, because of Gladstone's Home Rule Bill, he becomes a unionist, and so we know him today as a liberal unionist. Thomas Sinclair in 1912 was asked by James Craig to write the very first draft of the Solemn League and Covenant. And so he is a very important historical figure in the context of Northern Unionism. When he died, 1,000 UVF men marched in front of his remains to Belfast City Cemetery. This is the grave of Robert Thompson, and the Thompson Dry Dock is named after Robert. And this is part of the Titanic trail that you find here in the city cemetery. Those who are buried here with a strong association with the Titanic. And I said Robert had the new dry dock named after him, and of course the very famous pictures of the Titanic and the Olympic in the Thompson Dry Dock. This is the grave of Albert James Lewis and his wife Florence Augusta Lewis. These are the parents of C.S. Lewis of Narnia fame. In this grave lie the remains of Samuel Cleland Davison. Samuel Cleland was the founder of Scirocco Works. And so in this burial ground, you've got families who created the engineering base of Belfast. You've got the Mackeys here, Davison, Scirocco Works, others who really are the mercantile elite of this city. This is the grave of the Hutchinson family from Sandy Row. And look, Louisa, 21 months, Margaret, 11 and a half, William, 4 and a half, Daniel, 7, Mary, 18 months, Mary, 7 years, Hannah, 6 months, Samuel, 18 months. This stone is a reminder of the vulnerability of children in this city at the end of the 19th century. I looked at the year that Margaret died. Margaret died in 1897. And in a 5-week period, over 370 children died in this city. So that's over 10 children a day were dying in this city. And this stone is a reminder of the lives that were lost through, diphtheria, scarlet fever, mumps, diarrhea in Victorian Belfast. The green patches here, what look like fields, is in fact poor ground. In this cemetery, as I said earlier on, there are about 250,000 people buried in this cemetery. Of that, there are 80,000 buried in the poor ground, which really is a reflection on the poverty in Belfast in the 19th century and in the 20th century. And 80,000 people are buried here in the poor ground. And of course, beyond the poor ground, what you see is the perimeter wall of the Jewish burial ground. And there are about 300 members of the Jewish community buried in that small burial ground. And the last burial there was in 1964. This is the grave of Sadie Hale. Sadie was a typist on board the Lusitania, which was sank by a U-boat U-20 off the coast of Cork in 1915. In 1916, U-20 was given the task of bringing Roger Casement to Ireland. It got out into the North Sea but broke down and then had to be towed back to its base. Then U-19 was given the task of bringing Roger Casement to Ireland. Its captain had been the torpedo officer on board U-20, which had sunk the Lusitania. This is the grave of Bhéal Feirste. Had worked in the British diplomatic service, came to Ireland in 1847, and from the day and hour he came to this city, he used his wealth for the benefit of the people of this city and this island. When he died, there were about 5 people here at his graveside. Here lie the remains of Rutledge Kane, a very famous Belfast Orangeman. He was born in Omagh and he was the minister of Christ Church, which is at the corner of Durham Street and College Square North. He was a very senior Orangeman in this city. Rutledge Kane dedicated the Orange Hall on the Shankill Road, but he's reputed to have been an Irish speaker, and the banner at the Unionist Convention in Gobra, we think he's responsible. When the Gaelic League was formed in this city, Rutledge Kane is one of his sponsors. I hope you've enjoyed the short journey around the small number of graves that we have visited here in Belfast City Cemetery. This cemetery is a great repository of Belfast history. It is an important site in terms of those who are buried here and their stories. And there are over 250,000 stories here to be told by the numerous personalities and people, the men, women and children who are buried in this cemetery.